I'm going to turn the microphone over to Professor Julie Cohen, my colleague, my esteemed colleague at Georgetown Law School. Julie needs no introduction and is well known to all of you. So Julie.
Good morning, and thank you so much to Anupam and Hao Chen for organizing such a wonderful lineup of speakers. So our first panel this morning is called Theorizing the Nature of Data Sovereignty, and I gather it's going to be our goal to set some big picture themes for these 2 days. I'm not going to give a lengthy introduction to each of the speakers because you have that information in the online program. I will simply introduce, I'll say the order in which they're going to speak, which is also in the program. We'll begin with Professor Dan Svantesson, who is the professor, a professor of law and a co-director of the Center for Commercial Law at Bond University Faculty of Law in Australia, in Queensland. From there, we will hopscotch back to the US and Anupam Chander will present. And you've of course already heard from Anupam. From there, we will hopscotch to Europe, although Tomas Strines is currently based in the United States. He's executive director of Guarini Global Law and Tech program at New York University School of Law. He will talk about European data sovereignty. And from there, we will hopscotch over to India. And Professor Neha Mishra will present. She is about to commence a new position as lecturer in law at Australian National University, but she'll present on the Indian data sovereignty approach. So we will begin now with Professor Svantesson. Dan, where are you? Great.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that. At the end of last year, I did a talk on sovereignty in the context of cyber espionage. And in preparing for that talk, I read a few articles. One of them struck me as it contained the use of all these 13 different terms listed here: sovereignty, sovereign state, sovereign equality, sovereign decisions, and so forth. I'm not bringing this up to criticize the author, but rather I think it's a nice illustration of the messy area that we're dealing with here. There is a lot of terms being thrown around, often with a little attempt at defining clearly what we are dealing with. And you can note that the exciting terms that we are going to spend most of the time on here in this conference, data sovereignty or digital sovereignty or perhaps information sovereignty, are not part of the 13 here. So there's a lot of terms being thrown around, and I think that's normally a sign of something slightly ahead when it comes to law, when a lot of different expressions are used for roughly the same idea without then any distinction being drawn. But if we were to need more evidence of a mess we're in, I think we can look at a few scenarios that I have put together. The scenario, first one here, involves a situation. Let's say that a court in state A orders a party in state B to delete content held by it on servers in state B. The content is lawful under the state of laws of state B, but threatened with contempt of court. The party in state B complies with the order. Is this a violation of state sovereignty? I think looking at state practice as it stands now, there is little indication that states are viewing this as an infringement of their sovereignty. It's quite common, I would say, that court orders in one country affects the content being available in another state, whether hosted there or not. So this sort of situation does not seem generally now to be seen as an infringement of sovereignty, although I imagine that we will see potentially a change moving forward. In contrast, scenario 2 that I put together is this. Imagine that law enforcement in state A arrests a citizen of state A in state A and takes possession of a suspect's computer. Via the computer, the law enforcement agency downloads the suspect's files. that happen to be stored on a server in state B, perhaps through a cloud type structure. Is this a violation of state B's sovereignty? Here, tradition would have us conclude that yes, it is an infringement of sovereignty, even though here all that is happening is that the data in question is being accessed, while in scenario A, we had the data being deleted. That strikes me as odd. Things get more confusing, at least for me, if we look at scenario 3. In peacetime, state A hacked computers in a computer system in state B. Data of national security relevance are copied by state A. This is, in traditional thinking, generally not seen as a violation of state B's sovereignty, although I think we might be seeing changes in that too, perhaps. Of course, the proper answer to all of these questions, if you're a good lawyer, you will always answer with "it depends." And I recognize that there are nuances here that I haven't engaged with. As a whole, I think this shows the lack of coordination in relation to how we have approached sovereignty in relation to online activities. One of the reasons why we have the mess that we have, I think, is that I always blame territoriality for most things done so in relation to jurisdiction for a long time. But I think also here, tradition have us grounding sovereignty in the concept of territoriality in various forms. And I think once you try to apply the territoriality concept online, you end up in a messy situation. Put simply, I put it here as simply as I can, I think the binary nature of territoriality, so we have territorial or extraterritorial, clashes with the nuances that we see in reality. I took this photo some year or so ago from my veranda. Did I take it during daytime or nighttime? I took it at dawn. So the sort of binary day-night distinction, while useful in many settings, doesn't work for that. And of course, there's many nuances in the day and night transition. And I think it's the same thing with territoriality. Its binary nature works well for a few simple tasks, but it is a problem when we apply it in many other areas. So I think territoriality has a lot to answer for the problems we are experiencing in dealing with the sovereignty concept. Now, I want to change direction a little bit here and mention one of the core debates at the moment in literature has been around whether or not sovereignty is a standalone right that can be violated, or it's merely a general principle of law. And I just wanted to, in case anyone has missed it, New Zealand made an interesting contribution to that discussion just about a month ago, in which it sort of suggests, on my reading at least, it suggests that the sovereignty as such is just when a principle that cannot be violated in its own right, but it has elements, including territorial sovereignty, that can be violated. Non-intervention, use of force, and then the territorial sovereignty as the components that are actually rights that can be violated. But in general, there seemed to be a view that sovereignty is some form of a right that can in fact be violated. If you look at the famous Tallinn manual, that seems to be the view taken there and so on. And as soon as we then see sovereignty is a right that can be violated in its own right, and it's based in territoriality, and we consider how the internet operates, we find ourselves in a situation where there's going to be a large number of violations on a constant basis. So I think we need a filtering mechanism to distinguish those violations then that are serious and those that are not. If we don't have such a filter, there's a risk that due to the pervasiveness of violations, we would simply end up diluting the impact, or there will be a dilution of how we view the impact of genuine infringements of sovereignty. So what could we use as a filter then between invasions of sovereignty that are serious and those that are not? A concept that I had proposed some years ago together with Professor Polchak is the idea of state dignity. And we said something along the lines of at least the lega ferenda. It is tempting to suggest that an infringement of sovereignty would only result in legal consequences where it impacts the dignity of a state in question. In this sense, the reference to dignity would work like a filter sorting actions according to the level of infringement in which they result. I acknowledge that in a sense here, I'm just, so to speak, kicking the can down the road. Instead of trying to engage with defining sovereignty very tightly, we end up having to instead define something that I framed as state dignity, which I acknowledge is a concept that needs a lot of work too, and that is associated with complexity. But I think the big benefit of going in this direction, and I'll explore that much more in the chapter that for the book that will come out from this conference. I think the big advantage is that we move away from anchoring the assessment of sovereignty infringements in territoriality and finding a non-territorial focal point than being state dignity. So I look forward to exploring that and look forward to answering questions on that if there are any. Now, more generally, I think we need to spend some time thinking more about how sovereignty relates to the concepts that I list here. What's the connection or relationship between sovereignty and jurisdiction? How does those concepts relate to control? And where does territoriality really fit, or territory fit? And to what extent are we talking about exclusiveness when we talk about sovereignty? And I suspect I made this model sort of three-dimensional because I suspect there could be on the other side here additional concepts that we need to take account of, like perhaps statehood and so on. But I think we need to then do much more to consider how all these concepts as a cluster fit together, and that will be an important step for moving forward. Some other issues that we would need to address include this. We could perhaps conclude that sovereignty is in the end nothing more than a red herring as a concept. It doesn't tell us anything useful. If we want to dispute that, we need to show why it's relevant. We need to show why is it relevant for law, why is it relevant for international relations. And I am currently on a project looking at sovereignty in the defense context in Australia, and how does sovereignty fit in that context. So I think in a sense a starting point with a concept that has been used so broadly without any definition or in any uniform definition is that at this stage it looks a bit like a red herring, so we need to prove why it's not, in a sense. Now, perhaps we are actually currently expanding the definition of sovereignty when we should be narrowing it in. Perhaps if we took the view that sovereignty is something quite basic, like I put up here, sovereignty relates to the state having exclusive rights of some nature, or rights in relation to which they have primacy. If we view it that way, then statements like sovereign rights would just mean state rights that are exclusive and so on. So maybe then we can't talk about, and I realize in this I'm going a little bit against, I liked Frank's idea of functional sovereignty, and I see what I'm saying here is going slightly in a different direction than that, but perhaps we shouldn't speak about sovereignty outside the state context. Maybe it's more a matter of control or exclusiveness or whatever it might be. And more broadly, I think we need to do a lot to engage with the question whether or not data sovereignty, digital sovereignty, information sovereignty, and all that, are those concepts that we hear so often these days, are they actually anchored in the international law concept of sovereignty, or are they something much more political in nature? Now, drawing towards the end, because I want to keep this short, of course, I think we can say that there's three different roles of the law. The law is a tool to decide disputes. The law is a tool to provide a framework to control, guide, and plan life out of court. And those two points have been made by Hart a long time ago. And I argue that there's a third component here. The law is a tool to express and communicate values, societal values, put it simply. I think sovereignty is a dangerous concept because it's not doing a very good job in expressing and communicating values, because it's too unclear. It's not a useful framework to guide life out of court. And yet, I think sovereignty is being used as a measuring tool for infringements, even though it's so vague. So it is, in a sense, used as a tool to decide legal disputes. And that combination, they're lacking clarity with how it's being used, I think is a concern moving forward. In contrast, I think the internet is not the problem. The internet is not the cause of the problem. The internet here risks becoming a victim. This is not my idea. It came up in interviews done for a report I worked on some year ago. But I think this is important. What is at stake here is the internet. So it's the law is putting the internet's usefulness at stake, in a sense. And I want to conclude with some there and just put up some shameless self-promotion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Svantesson. And so that's the perfect provocation to lead into Anupam Chander's remarks, because he's going to address the question of what exactly the internet is, and whether in fact it might be a Western idea rather than something with more fixed and immutable qualities. And so please, Anupam, take it away.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Dan, for a terrific presentation. I would love to have talked about your paper for the next hour, but let me share my slides here quickly. Okay, so an internet of Western values is the question that I want to ask. So, and this is spurred, the entire project is spurred by a comment by Mike Pompeo, Secretary Mike Pompeo of the United States, in a news conference with the German foreign minister, and so Heiko Maas. And so in this, he says, the US will seek to maintain an internet with Western values embedded in it. Okay. And this wasn't a casual off-the-cuff statement. He repeated it multiple times, a similar formulation multiple times over the next few weeks. And we find resonance of this statement in Mark Zuckerberg in a debate with Thierry Breton this last year, a clear regulatory framework that comes out of Western democratic countries should become a standard around the world. And it is not a coincidence that this is actually, these statements were both made with European leaders present. And we find a similar expression within Europe. Here from early 2020, a statement from Brussels, a new EU-US agenda for global change, and a statement at the end of when President-elect Biden is selected, a statement from the EU Commission communicating a desire to work together to set a transatlantic agenda. Okay, so the a new transatlantic coalition that would set the rules for the internet based on common values between the US and Europe. So I want to challenge this framing. First, it's important to note that implicit in this framing is some vision of the West as the global paragon of values, a moral leader bringing light and technology to the world. And there's famous quip associated, attributed to Mahatma Gandhi. And the quip goes, when asked, what do you think of Western civilization? Gandhi is reported to have answered, I think it would be a good idea. It's interesting then that it's Europeans also who complain about American tech companies, but that complaint is often seems tinged with some envy. Is the concern, sorry, I think I'm hearing a little bit of, if anyone who is unmuted could make sure to mute themselves, would be great. Okay, so there seems to be, in some sense, is the concern of the Europeans in this context that Europeans are subject to colonization by foreign corporations? Or is the concern more deeply that it is not European corporations that are the ones doing the colonizing? Here is EU Commissioner Thierry Breton declaring the EU's ambition to be at the top of the race in the data economy. Okay, so the goal is to be, to grow its own tech giants, not necessarily to replace the American ones, but there seems to be a kind of mixed question of what the motivation truly is in this context. And this is reminiscent of the European scramble for Africa. In 1884 and 1885, you will recall, European powers met in Berlin. And the question is this yet another Berlin conference seeking to carve up the world so that it can be led by the civilized nations of the world? Tony Anghie writes about the Berlin Conference that it transformed Africa into a conceptual terra nullius. And in some sense, that is the approach that the West often takes with respect to other nations, terra nullius, a lawless territory that to be conquered and governed. And one might recall that the Berlin Conference was promoted as a philanthropic act rather than the subordination of the natives. So then we might ask the question, what are these Western values that Mike Pompeo and Mark Zuckerberg would like to promote globally? Let's examine 3 possible values. An internet that lacks centralized control, an internet that doesn't have surveillance built in, and an internet committed to free expression. So let's begin with the first. Is an internet free of centralized control a Western idea? Well, I'm reminded of Minitel. Minitel is, of course, the French network that was created alongside the internet network. And Minitel, in order to connect a service to Minitel, it required prior authorization from the executive branch of the French government. Even then, Julian Milland and Kevin Driscoll argue in a book that Minitel was still freer than American walled gardens such as AOL and even the Apple App Store. So here is AOL's logo. And it was only when I prepared for this, the PowerPoint for this conference, that I realized how much the AOL logo looked like an ad for the Illuminati. Okay. And the other question then is, does the West promise an internet free of government surveillance? Well, the Snowden revelations, of course, should have put a rest to this claim. The NSA's mass surveillance across the world demonstrated that surveillance was not, lack of surveillance was not the key feature of Western values of the internet. And it's important to note here that the UK's intelligence services were deeply implicated by the Snowden revelations. Consider as well the Italian hacking company called Hacking Team, which sold surveillance software across the world, including to the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, the successor's agency to the KGB. This is the current website of Hacking Team's successor company, Memento Labs. Elite hackers foraged in the underground. That is how they advertise themselves to the world. Okay, perhaps then it's freedom from a different kind of surveillance capitalism. Well, at least if the company is based in Europe. So I decided to take a look at the main European app that I use every day, which is Spotify. So does the fact that I pay for a subscription service now render me clear of surveillance capitalism? Here is Spotify's statement. We work with advertising partners to enable us to customize the advertising you may receive. These partners help us deliver more relevant ads and promotional messages, which may include interest-based advertising, also known as online behavioral advertising, contextual advertising, and generic advertising. So they do profiling. And they are now set to use that profiling to target ads, to place particular ads in every podcast that you get. So you will get a different ad than someone else who listens to the same podcast. Okay. And I might also, as a side note that I cannot find a way to export my Spotify playlists. Here's my Christmas time playlists. Despite the promise of data portability written in the beautiful GDPR. Okay. Then perhaps the question is that it is the Western value here to be preserved is free expression. Here, of course, we might begin by noting that there are substantial differences in the West itself about how to balance free expression with other liberties. I might also note that the day before Secretary Pompeo declared his support for internet with Western values embedded in it, his State Department announced a new question on applications for US visas. Do you have a social media presence? And under oath, you have to now give us all the usernames that you have used in the last 5 years. So apparently, before we allow you into our country, we're checking what you have said about us. Now, by describing the failures of Western governments to live up to these alleged Western values, I don't mean to suggest any false equivalence between them and authoritarian regimes. Rather, I want to suggest that both authoritarian and exploitative impulses exist across the world, and that the West is not an unequivocal force for justice and righteousness. So why does this matter? Why does it matter whether the internet is seen as embedded with Western values? If we believe that only certain countries share values, then it is easier to exclude the others from a variety of benefits, especially from the benefits of a global internet, whether those benefits be economic, political, or social. We may create spaces that only, quote, civilized, unquote, states may participate in. Consider 3 concrete examples. First, countries might bar access to data on grounds that data is unsafe outside the transatlantic union. Okay. This is a possible result of certain interpretations of the GDPR, for example. Here is a map of the world showing the countries that are declared adequate for data transfer. As you'll see, it is largely a transatlantic route. Japan and the EU recently negotiated a new trade agreement, and alongside that negotiation, there was a negotiation about offering reciprocal data protection adequacy rulings between the two areas. And so Japan has joined this. Argentina and Uruguay are, of course, an exception to this largely Western approach, but they're also very, very small places. Okay. Second, access to data. So this approach can deny businesses in developing countries access to Western markets. Second, access to data for law enforcement purposes might be restricted to certain preferred governments. The USA Cloud Act permits foreign government access for law enforcement, even for serious crimes, only to countries with which we have an executive agreement, or through a process that can take almost a year, on average exactly 10 months. Thus far, we have only one executive agreement with the UK. Third, the US Judicial Redress Act extends the right to pursue certain civil remedies against the US government under the Privacy Act to citizens of designated foreign countries. You can guess which countries are so designated. So what is an alternative, to conclude quickly, what is an alternative to an internet based on Western values? At the beginning of the last decade, a different US Secretary of State offered a different vision. In a famous speech in 2010, Hillary Clinton declared, quote, the freedom to connect as a core freedom. But rather than asserting this as an American or Western value, she founded the freedom in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We should be able to demand responsible technologies without reverting to old tropes about a Western civilization prizing liberty and equality and an Eastern civilization prizing domination and conformity. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anupam. That was thought-provoking, and once again, a really great segue into the next panelist. So that must mean whoever put this conference together did a really excellent job, and that would be Anupam and Hao Chen. So our next speaker is Thomas Schreins, who is going to speak to us about the quest for European data sovereignty. Please, Thomas, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Julie, and welcome everyone. I'm very glad to be here, and let me just share my screen. Okay. So it's a great pleasure to be part of this conference. Like many others, I would have wished we would be able to meet in Hong Kong in person, but I think one positive aspect is that we have plenty of participants who join us from around the world and listen to our debates. In my short presentation, I try to draw some connections to what we already heard from Ben and Anupam and what we're going to hear from Neha. So the questions that I'm wondering about are, what is distinctive about a European approach to data sovereignty, and how is the EU grappling with the jurisdictional challenges that Dan was talking about? And building on what Anupam just said, one could ask whether current regulatory efforts by the European Union might be attempts to integrate more European values into the ecosystem under which the digital transformation of societies and economies around the globe is taking place. And Neha is, of course, going to talk about the Indian conception of data sovereignty. And I think a big question from a normative perspective is whether data sovereignty is the right framing to discuss these different jurisdictions, and whether we should be careful to distinguish between countries with different historical trajectories, different political systems, and different values when they invoke this concept, which, as several speakers have already pointed out, and more will point out over today and tomorrow, is certainly not a well-defined one. And what I will present to you is definitely not going to be the one definition of European data sovereignty. Indeed, tomorrow you'll hear one by Theodore Christakis about European digital sovereignty. But what I will try to do is to conceptualize a certain understanding of European data sovereignty that makes sense to me, and that elucidates, I think, certain challenges that any country that invokes data sovereignty to regulate data needs to confront, including the European Union. In my presentation, I'm drawing on several research projects I've been involved in, and I'm recombining them in some way. Most importantly, the Global Data Law project that I'm leading with Angelina Fischer and Benedict Kingsbury at NYU Law School, launched 2 years ago, and now being developed through a course that we first taught last spring and will teach again in the coming spring. And I'm drawing on a chapter on the evolution of European data law beyond data protection law that I just finished for the next edition of a book about the evolution of EU law. And finally, and that's probably the closest connection to the framing that the organizers gave to this conference, I'm drawing on a paper with Matthew Erie on China's digital Silk Road as a form of transnational data governance. And this is where I want to start my journey into the question of European data sovereignty. Because if you think about the Belt and Road Initiative, the sprawling infrastructure-based enterprise that China is engaged in, we can see how geographically, at least in its initial setup, it was directed to Europe and connects the rising economic power of the 21st century with the old continental European market that is still very important in terms of purchasing power. What has been somewhat overlooked in the literature is that there's also a digital component to the Belt and Road Initiative, the Digital Silk Road, which encompasses various physical infrastructure projects that are necessary to provide digital infrastructure. And recently, the Council of Foreign Relations created a dedicated website to this whole initiative, asking the pertinent normative question whether the digital Silk Road is a good thing for economic development or a bad thing, a danger to freedom, as the Council of Foreign Relations put it. And if you look at the map that they curated, you can see that there are indeed connections between the digital Silk Road enterprise that China is leading in certain European countries or former European countries, in the case of the United Kingdom. So what I want to do in my presentation, in my paper, is to not look at those connectivity questions and questions of sovereignty in terms of digital autonomy or independence as opposed to dependence on another infrastructure provider. And I'm also less interested in the geopolitical questions that such entanglement creates. That's much more in the paper with Matthew Erie. But what I want to tease out a little bit more is whether there's also a conceptual connection between the kind of data sovereignty that China has been putting forward and the kind of data sovereignty that the European Union might be promoting. Now, Chinese conception of data sovereignty, as I understand it, based on my reading of the literature, is really a continuation of the earlier discourse in internet governance institutions about the role of governments, where cyber sovereignty was invoked by China as an assertion of governmental control over the internet against multi-stakeholder free flow of data internet governance that the US promoted. And data sovereignty is then an extension of that concept, asserting governmental control, not just over the internet and the data flows that the internet enables, but also about data generation and datafication, all aspects of society and economy that are being mediated through data. In contrast, the European, and there are conceptually some commonalities between this Chinese conception of data sovereignty and the European one. The most decisive ones, in my view, are that China and the EU now both realize that data is not just a privacy issue, but also a question of economic development. Data is an economic resource, in particular for machine learning, and it's also a medium of governance or a medium for exercise of power. But the ways in which China and the EU respectively then assert control over data really differs in various ways. And I want to focus just on some aspects of those differences without making broader claims about the big normative differences that I see between the way in which the EU is articulating its vision for the future of the digital economy in society, and the ways in which China is asserting its vision by way of its fundamentally authoritarian regime. Now, if one thinks about European data sovereignty, one can, again, operate with different conceptions. The one that I will use in my paper in this presentation basically understands European data sovereignty as the European attempt to regulate data through law. So it's that plank of sovereignty scholarship that is closely associated with ideas of democracy and with ideas of the rule of law. So the idea is that a given public, in this case, European people, through the idiosyncratic institutions that they have created in the European Union, is asserting their will through law to regulate data with various regulatory objectives, some of which might also have economic implications, as Anupam alluded to. But I would strongly suggest that these various institutions that are engaged in European lawmaking are not just interested in creating European champions, they're also interested in addressing social and economic problems of the kinds that Frank Pasquale talked about in his presentation. And I'm drawing in my paper a lot on the European Strategy for Data that the European Commission announced last year, which charts a really ambitious and complex regulatory agenda for the future of the digital economy that really transcends data protection law. So with all the emphasis on the GDPR, I think it's time to shift away the focus from traditional data protection privacy law and to recognize, for example, the salience of the regulation of non-personal data that is completely outside the scope of existing data protection law, but of immense economic importance and also importance for governance reasons. And similarly, there are other laws at the intersection of transparency laws and intellectual property laws that have salience for questions of data ownership. And I would like to suggest that all these laws together form a corpus of European data law that is animated by this idea of European data sovereignty, that data within Europe should be governed by European law. This then is being extended into all kinds of European data spaces that have all one thing in common. The idea is that sectoral regulation through law will make certain adjustments to the ways in which data is being shared and exchanged and accessed between different actors in these various sectors. And then just in the last couple of months, the Commission put forward the Data Governance Act, the Digital Services Act, and the Digital Markets Act, which are to be followed by the Data Act, all designed to address various issues within the digital economy. And I would like to suggest that these laws too can be understood as laws that attempt to regulate data in certain ways. That's not their exclusive focus, and maybe not even their main ambition, but they add to the corpus of European data law that we're seeing. Now, that's the agenda. That's what the European Union wants to do through its laws. But it is, of course, confronting all the challenges that Dan Svensson was talking about. Most importantly, the jurisdictional challenge that the internet, in theory, enables global data flows through connectivity and protocols. And here comes an actor that is traditionally understood to be territorially bound and that seeks to assert the authority over its law, over an infrastructure that is more or less global in nature. And if one looks at the ways in which the EU law grapples with these issues, it's really interesting to see how the EU has been pioneering certain approaches to come to a realignment between jurisdictional authority and the globality of the internet that sometimes, at least, eschews the traditional focus on territoriality. So the GDPR, for example, and future data laws by the EU as well applies regardless of where the processing of the data takes place, because all that matters is that the data controller in question is offering goods and services to the European market or is monitoring the data of individuals within the EU. And while there was a lot of pushback and discussion about this kind of extraterritoriality in the beginning, it seems to me that this is an issue where the EU has largely succeeded in convincing regulators around the world that this is a sensible approach. Why should it matter where the data processing takes place? Aren't we more concerned about what is happening with the data that is being collected in a given jurisdiction. What is more controversial, of course, is other legal technologies that the EU employs, like the adequacy assessments that Anupam already alluded to, can be understood as forms of conditionality that the EU also tried out with regard to its failed database directive. And we can see these kinds of conditionalities in other jurisdictions as well, as attempts to expand the jurisdictional reach of the EU to effectuate European data sovereignty in confrontation of not just the problem of jurisdictional misalignment, but also of the problem that data as a regulatory object can be highly mobile and can be moved around, creating potential for regulatory arbitrage, much along the lines of Katerina Pistor's work in the Code of Capital. So those are the jurisdictional issues about which there's, of course, much more to say, but I want to close with two more challenges that the EU face, that the EU's approach to data sovereignty creates. And the first is really a democracy challenge, where the conventional wisdom has been that the internet is really, internet governance is really confronted with an authoritarianism challenge. So authoritarian governments might curtail data flows, and that's bad for the internet and needs to be opposed for that reason. But there's also a real democracy problem in internet governance that internet governance institutions haven't really grappled with. On this slide, you see how ICANN has created centers around the world to become more global, to become more accessible. But even that institution at the heart of the internet infrastructure can hardly claim to really reflect the global will of the netizens, even though that is much of the rhetoric that is being advanced in internet governance institutions and by those who think that the nation state as the traditional locus for democratic self-governance is over. But there's also a flip side to this, and that is that as much as the EU prides itself for having a relatively democratic way of lawmaking, including through the European Parliament that you see in the slide, there is this challenge that European law, as Anna Bradford puts it in her book on the Brussels effect, can rule the world. And the question is whether that is really just cause for celebration and whether it shouldn't be also cause for reflection. In this regard, just to enter one sovereignty scholar at the end of my presentation, I'm drawing on Eyal Ben-Ministi's work on sovereignty, who is advancing a conception of sovereignty that argues that the traditional sovereignty has very much the castle in mind, where everyone can do whatever they want, throw parties, be as loud as you want. But that's not the world in which we live in anymore. We live in an apartment building where what you do affects others. And I think that's an inescapable reality with regard to almost any kind of data governance due to the transnationality and interconnectivity under which we live today. And European institutions, at least so far, have not been sufficiently attuned to the externalities that they are creating for other countries. And I'll close here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tomas. So we're going to India now for our final presentation. And that will be by Professor Neha Mishra. Are you ready, Neha?
Okay, thank you, and sorry for the technical delay. I'm really delighted to be a part of this panel and to be also part of this conference. And what I plan to cover in the next few minutes is to just give you some idea about the specificities of the Indian data sovereignty approach, which is slightly different and also somewhat similar to what Thomas was talking about in the context of the European Union. And because of the predominantly economic rationale behind the data sovereignty approach, I think I'll also briefly highlight on the possible impact that this approach might have on India's foreign trade policy in the coming years. So just to begin, what does data sovereignty really mean for India? How is it being conceptualized in different policy frameworks? Now, the idea of data sovereignty that India is portraying and projecting through many of its different policy frameworks is quite similar to natural resource sovereignty. So the whole idea is that this is data of Indians, it belongs to India, it must be used for India's development to achieve policy priorities that India considers important and consistent with Indian laws and regulations. And this whole agenda comes across as a very strong nation branding effort. And therefore there is some political appeal to this whole ideology of data sovereignty within India at the moment. But there is a certain juxtaposition in this idea of data sovereignty as well. On the one hand, there is a recognition of individuals owning their data and having rights over the data, but also the fact that the state is often seen as being the custodian of such data, or a trustee of that data. So in some sense, data has become like a national asset, an economic asset, by which the state should manage and control and decide who should be using it for commercial profit and how. And that tussle between protecting individual rights and the state having control over how data is managed often comes across in different policy frameworks that India is currently developing. And it seems that the focus is concentrated more on the state having power over how data is used and managed, and who actually gets to use it. Now, there are multiple policy rationales because of the kind of broad idea of data sovereignty that is, depending on which regulation or proposed policy framework you're looking at, that these multiple policy rationales which may relate to the idea of data sovereignty. Some of it is very similar to what you see across many even Western countries, which is ensuring application of domestic laws, or increasing or ensuring regulatory access to data, or addressing national security concerns. And typically, the method or the tools that Indian government has been promoting is data localization, and also in context of security, banning, for instance, certain foreign apps that the government thinks is insecure, or to restrict investment in certain sectors that they think are strategic digital sectors. But the other aspect is about promoting domestic data champions, promoting domestic data industries, and ensuring that the data that is being generated within the India benefits Indian companies, not foreign companies. And while it is not explicit, but if you read between the lines in many of these policy frameworks, the whole idea of the state being able to manage the whole process of generating economic profit from data comes across very strongly. Now, there's often comparison of that, a lot of people think that the Indian model is kind of a crude amalgamation of the EU and Chinese models. But as Thomas pointed out, it's important to also see what the subtle differences are, and based on the history of the country, but also the fact that there are different different governance structures in different countries. So with respect to the EU, one of the main reasons why people tend to equate or think there's similarities, because the Indian Data Protection Bill borrows very heavily from the GDPR. But unlike the GDPR, the notion of state control is much stronger in the proposed Indian Data Protection Bill. So for instance, the central government can exempt any government agency from complying with the requirements under the data protection law, which is a very broad exemption, considering the language that is used is that the government should think it's necessary or expedient for reasons such as public interest or national security. On the other hand, if you try to compare it with the Chinese model, the reason why the comparison is made obviously is because the tendency towards internet control in different data governance frameworks that are being proposed. But at the same time, India has a different political system. It does not have the same kind of regulatory capacity that China does. And there is no sustained economic agenda. For instance, China has this whole model of digital Silk Road. India does not really have that kind of a sustained agenda to access markets in the developing world. And rather, a lot of focus remains on the domestic market and to create opportunities domestically for Indian companies. Now, this slide, I just put it together to give you an idea of how there are different regulators dealing with different aspects of data regulation, and there are some overlapping domains of regulations as well. For instance, privacy and cybersecurity is dealt with by multiple agencies. Also, the fact that many of these ministries and the frameworks that they are coming up with contains data localization requirements, but the scope can be quite different. For instance, there was a draft e-commerce policy that the Ministry of Commerce put out, and the scope of data localization in this policy was much broader than what the IT ministry had envisaged. Also, given such a complex regulatory structure, it's perhaps not surprising, but there are also these tussles between these different regulators. And in fact, there was recently, with respect to AI governance and AI, developing the AI sector in India, because the IT ministry and Niti Aayog were both dealing with it. Ultimately, the government had to set up a committee to resolve the differences between the two bodies to make sure that both of them they know which part of AI governance and AI developing India's AI program that they will be dealing with. Also with the IT ministry, I think Thomas mentioned something similar in the context of the EU, but there are two different regulatory frameworks now being developed for personal data and non-personal data. And the assumption is that there is a very clear distinction between these two categories of data. And the fact that personal data relates to individual rights, while non-personal data relates to data that can be used for economic profit. And what the government is actually proposing is that it can require any company to share its data, non-personal data, with its competitors, as long as it's anonymized, even though anonymization is, as we know, not a bulletproof mechanism. And at the same time, ignoring the potential for certain group privacy concerns arising, especially because one of the data categories, sharing of data categories that the government wants to enable is community data. So there is no whole of government approach, and all these inconsistencies mean that in the long run, there are uncertainties as to how different types of data will be governed by these different regulations that are currently being developed across these frameworks. Now, if I were to think of some of the key regulatory trends, if you look at the different bills that are there or the different policy frameworks that are there or ongoing being discussed and in public consultation, I already mentioned one of the first things is just treating data as an economic asset. But also there is this whole idea that any data, whether it's in the personal sphere, private sphere, proprietary sphere, has to be regulated, because ultimately that's the way in which the government can ensure economic development and make sure that data is used in the best way possible to protect interests of users, as well as probably establish a strong state control. And one of the ways that the government is going about doing it is to just have these different data categories: personal data, non-personal data, critical, sensitive, community, public data, and also a variety of new regulators on non-personal data, on data trustees, consent managers, and they're just putting up this very complex framework which enhances regulatory control in different forms. At the same time, and many of you might already know that the Indian government sits over this wealth of biometric information. They have a whole database of 1 billion people, billion plus people under the Aadhaar system. And they are now linking up this biometric data to education, health, payments, different kinds of sectors, and building up this very big portal called the India Stack. And some people identify this as a kind of digital ID capitalism, where the government gets to use data for economic profit. The other key trend I would kind of focus on is just this immense obsession with data localization being a powerful tool to achieve economic interest, regulatory interest, to address security concerns. And even though if you broadly look at the civil society and the business community within India, there are a variety of views on the advantages and disadvantages of data localization. For instance, a lot of small businesses have been concerned about the compliance cost and the impact on innovation, especially in sectors like fintech, where small entrepreneurs also have a lot of potential to come up with innovative products, but data localization tends to be a huge barrier for them. In addition to that, within the civil society, aside from the civil liberties and the potential dangers to civil liberties, there is also dialogue on economic freedom and choice, and whether data localization might be harmful and not a very proportionate and necessary measure for that. And although there are these different dialogues within the Indian community, within business or civil society, if you look across many policy frameworks, there is no substantive dialogue on, or a substantive cost-benefit analysis of these different viewpoints. And also, while there is this nationalist undertone that anything that is local and domestic, whether it's local AI, local cloud service, local platforms, all this is going to be beneficial for India and create income redistribution opportunities. There is no dialogue actually as to why that's the case, and what about all the other facets that have been brought forth by the small scale sector within India, or the generally amongst users in India. The other aspect of this whole notion of data sovereignty is that the government has not yet at least focused very carefully on the kind of regulatory costs, and it's especially important for a developing country, huge developing country with limited regulatory resources. Just to take an example, the Personal Data Protection Bill, which I mentioned, has a lot of obligations similar to the GDPR. Just trying for a new regulator, trying to monitor thousands and thousands of businesses that collect personal data, and to ensure that they are actually complying with the regulatory requirement, almost seems impossible, and there's a very good chance of weak enforcement. At the same time, you also have concerns regarding state surveillance, simply because a lot of discretion has been provided to the state under the Data Protection Bill. So that kind of seems to suggest that this is, again, not something that has gone through a very detailed cost-benefit analysis within India. Now, because there is such a underlying economic rationale behind India's approach to data governance, I think it's also important to identify how that affects India's position in international policy community, particularly for international trade agreements. And what India has done, as some of you might already know, is to just outright refuse to participate on any discussions around digital trade, whether it's at the WTO or in some regional trade organizations or frameworks. And one of the main arguments that India has, of course, is that they want to preserve their policy space. Now, India actually hasn't made many commitments at the WTO under the General Agreement on Trade and Services on different kinds of digital services. So it does actually already have the policy space, but it's quite clear that moving forward, it does not think it's in the interest of India and other developing countries to have such rules in place. But to me, the way I look at it, India has benefited immensely in the past by being an integral part of the digital economy. The digital services export sector in particular has benefited immensely. So it seems that ring fencing the digital economy right now may be a case of like winning the battle but losing the war, because by just simply refusing to participate, India is losing the opportunity to shape future trade rules, and also some of the ambitions that have been set out in these frameworks. For instance, India wants to be a provider of choice of AI for developing countries, or wants to increase the content in digital exports. I'm not so sure how that could be achieved without entering into dialogues with trading partners and engaging with possibilities of more regulatory cooperation. And finally, there are geopolitical consequences, even if there are no trade violations, because a lot of tech innovation in India has been funded by Chinese and US companies in the past few years. And especially with India's differences with China now, some of that investment is going to stop flowing in, and a lot of small scale startups are really worried how that might affect them in the future. So just in conclusion, and as all the speakers have rightly pointed out, when it comes to data governance and the right approach, how to go about doing it, it's a very complex question. When you think of a very huge developing country like India, it becomes probably even more complex. So one of the things that I think is very important is, instead of having very restrictive and comprehensive regulatory frameworks, and very ambitious frameworks, is to think of more pragmatic and progressive policy choices. And I think one of the first things to look at in the Indian context would be to look for regulatory structures and mechanisms that will help build digital trust and incentivize innovation within the digital economy. And that necessarily means taking into account the interests of small businesses and individual users within the Indian economy. India, being a developing country with significant political leverage, could actually be a very important contributor to this global dialogue on digital trade and bring new perspectives from the developing world. So it seems a little unfortunate that it's not progressing in that direction, but rather in the direction of data nationalism, where if all countries start acting in the same way, we would not really see more integration within the digital economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mishra. So we have a good amount of time left for questions and discussion now. And while I kick things off with a question of my own, I want to invite members of the audience to put questions into the Q&A chat. And I'll take a look at that in a moment. So what I would like to do is I want to invite each of you to think for a moment about, although the topic of the panel is keyed toward data, and indeed, Tomas is absolutely correct to note that a significant problem that we're confronting is the mobility of data as a regulatory object. Data move over networks that are bound together by standards and endpoint devices, and the content of those standards is a subject of governance. And so in a sense, therefore, the problem is the problem of standards as well as the problem of data. In my own book, Between Truth and Power, I argued that what we need to be doing at this point, rather than focusing on sort of 19th century taxonomies of sovereignty or debate about values kind of in the air detached from standards, is that we need to understand that major powers are in effect waging a legal standards war against a background of interdependence, not independence, right? The question is membership in regulatory networks and the content of the standards that will bind the networks together. And because that we are coming to that problem against a background of existing legacy institutions for trade and data protection and the like, there's significant amounts of arbitrage being undertaken through these existing institutions. And we're seeing clusters of authority or power emerging, right? There's the Chinese cluster and the US cluster, which is sort of a vacuum, right? Neoliberal information capitalism as waged by large US tech companies. And the EU cluster, which purports to be about democracy, but as Anupam points out, there are some quibbles one could make with that. So I'd like, if you would, each of you to reflect for a moment on the sense in which a focus on interdependence and standards might help us begin to focus on at least sort of what are the crucial questions to be addressing, and you can take that in any way you want. And perhaps the place to start with that is, well, who wants to start? I won't call on you because that's rude. You can just unmute and we'll have a free for all for a moment. Anupam, go ahead.
I was actually pointing at Dan, but you couldn't tell that from my.
Oh, sorry.
So that doesn't, yeah, pointing here doesn't work, does it?
Yes, no.
Happy to start if.
Yeah,
Okay.
Dan.
Go ahead, Dan.
I see where you're pointing now, so I understand what's going on. Right. I don't have so much to say on it. There's one thing that I want to say one thing that I would cover in the paper and that I've been working a little bit on now is the idea that one of the big problems we're facing, and it relates to what you're saying, is there is no body with sufficient capacity or mandate really to deal with these issues. If there is too many boxes in a sense. People in one box are talking about law enforcement access to cross-border data, but they might not have a mandate to deal with the data privacy aspects of it fully. There's people dealing with a transfer of personal information in a data protection box that might not have mandate to deal with all the other related topics to that. And because we are dealing with everything in little boxes, we end up with approaches fitting for those boxes, but don't then in the end fit together at all. And I think that is one of the big concerns. Even the big organizations around the world, some might have a trade focus that can't deal with the data protection side fully and so on, right? So too many little boxes creating a patchwork that doesn't really fit together would be my thoughts on that.
So let me pick up from Dan, and I'm going to connect it to Neha's wonderful comments as well. So Dan began by asking, what is the international standards body? And one of them, and it's very limited, is the WTO. Very, very limited, right? You know, the WTO scope is while it's seen as over powerful, it's also extremely weak and narrow. And so I think both are kind of true at the same time. But there is a sense in which the WTO can serve a useful role here. One of the two sticking points for India in particular and South Africa more recently have been issues of customs duties across borders, customs on quote e-commerce or digital products occurring, and so this is an interesting debate to have. And I think Neha rightly points out that debate is better with India participating in the discussions and South Africa participating in the discussions. So the joint statement initiative, which is this kind of effort to create a plurilateral agreement within the WTO system related to e-commerce or the digital economy, I think needs large developing countries participating to represent their own interests and and shape them. And I think it's better to be at that table. And referring to the Berlin conference, there were no African powers present. It would have been better to have the African powers present at the table. And so I'm not sure that would have made for ultimately a better result, but it's certainly better to proceed in that way.
So thank you, Anupam, and it strikes me, though, that one thing one might also say about the WTO is that it has at its core constitutive values that are trade values, right? That's kind of it's almost so general as to not be very informative, but trade values are not, for example, democratic values per se, although it's possible to make arguments linking the two sets of values. And Tomas has now unmuted, as I was hoping to get you to do, so please jump in.
Yeah, I think it really follows up on what all of you said. I definitely agree with the premise of your question, Julie, that focusing on interdependence as a reality and to some extent probably an inevitability, is generative, because then it becomes about how to manage such interdependence, how to deal with externalities, how to organize governance around interdependence, and how to imagine maybe different institutions, which then runs into the problem that Dan identified. And my sense on that institution building question is that it's probably a futile exercise to imagine the perfect institution that would address all the question of data governance. And it's certainly very worthwhile to address the intense silification and try to build bridges between the existing institutions. But it's probably also unavoidable that some fora will be used to create new rules for the digital economy and for the transformation of societies that are actually not perfect, that have outdated value sets or that are captured by certain concentrated interests. And on that note, I know that I have a little bit more skeptical take than Anupam and Neha on efforts by the United States in recent trade agreements to create new rules for the digital economy or for digital trade as the US push for them. And there's a reason why the EU doesn't want to sign these kinds of agreements, because the EU does not want that a panel of unelected trade arbitrators decides whether the EU's data protection regime is necessary or not. And that's also why, if I was advising developing countries, I would be cautious to enter into these kinds of agreements at a moment in which the pathways towards digital developments and towards managing the transformation towards digital societies and economies are really open and contested. And what has always bothered me about the discourse in trade, but I think it's really a broader problem on data governance, is really the lack of data about data. There's a lot of policy making without sound empirical emphasis, and that's true on both sides. So it's true with regard to what Neha was talking about, that India is advancing data sovereignty policies without actually knowing how those would shake out. But it's also true with regard to the free data flow policies that we've been advocating for and that are getting entrenched in free trade agreements.
And can I ask you, Thomas, to just say like 2 sentences more, because you referred to externalities and a questioner in the chat also wanted to know exactly what you meant by that. What do you mean by that? Right.
So that's, of course, a complicated concept, but it really tries to capture the problem that arises from interdependence. So one things are interdependent, what one actor does has implications for other actors, and that can shake out in different ways. So one example that I had in mind is indeed the Brussels effect type scenario of the kind where corporations gravitate towards European law and just decide that this is the standard according to which they want to offer goods and services, not just with regard to the EU, where they have to do that, but with regard to countries around the world. Now, one can say from the perspective of data protection law, isn't that great? Everyone is complying with the GDPR, and that's indeed how the EU is celebrating that quite offensively. But maybe it should be for the countries and for the people within those countries or within communities or indigenous peoples to decide for themselves how they want to be serviced and how they want to be datafied or indeed not. And another externality that we recently encountered in our work with international organizations is that humanitarian organizations like the United Nations are very concerned because to some extent they are dependent on private sector data. And now suddenly all these private sector entities are telling the United Nations that they can't provide the data because they're scared about being slapped with sanctions under the GDPR. So this is another example where the GDPR, just by regulating European data, creates externalities for other actors that have not been involved in the lawmaking process that created those laws in the first place.
Great, thank you. Neha, do you want to weigh in at this point? And in addition to whatever else you wanted to say, there is a question in the chat that asks, is it fair to characterize India as swinging between the data sovereignty approach of the 3 large blocks that I described? And you don't have to buy into that description, but please.
I agree more with Anupam than with Thomas on the points that were discussed. So I'll not elaborate further on that, but I think it's important to create structures for trust when it comes to the digital economy. And one of the ways of creating trust is to engage in regulatory dialogues, whether it's on issue of standards or for standards for data transfer, for instance, would only come in the long run through trust enhancing mechanisms between countries. So I think it's worthwhile, whether it's at the WTO or elsewhere, to engage in these dialogues. And on the specific question, I think it's right to think that India's stance on data sovereignty is quite confusing, because they have so on the one hand they seem to be a big fan of the Chinese approach because it allows for immense state control, but at the same time they realize that it does not align particularly well with their democratic values, and also is not something they really have the regulatory capacity to implement in such a short time. India has also traditionally been quite open. I mean, there is this, I would say, a love-hate relationship with US companies, because US companies and bring in a lot of investment to India. I think last year, all the big US tech companies invested almost $20 billion in India. So they do see a lot of opportunity coming from the US. I think Facebook is now tied up with Reliance, which is one of the biggest players in India, to form a local digital platform. So there is this tendency to switch between these different regulatory models. But I would say, as with many other Indian domestic regulatory frameworks, India tends to observe what others are doing and then come up with a crude combination of these different regulatory models contextualized to its very specific domestic conditions. So I think that would be my response to the question.
Thank you. Okay, so there is, I'm pulling this next one from the chat, which is two parts. And then I'm going to editorialize a little. So question one, does the categorization of data into personal and non-personal leading to further categorizations, is it helpful in optimally regulating data? And is it even possible to make that kind of categorization? And then the questioner also asks, are developing countries confronting a dilemma between empowering domestic digital development and promoting global regulatory coherence for innovation? And the editorialization that I want to make on that is, of course, we've all become, or we become trained to some sense in counterposing innovation and regulation, but perhaps exactly the problem that we're dealing with right now is the need to understand regulation as a site of innovation, so we can figure out how to solve these interdependence problems, right? That seems to demand a species of innovation. But who wants to talk about either whether we can solve this problem by slicing up the world of data into personal and non-personal? Yeah, Anupam, go ahead.
So I just want to respond because I want to say hello to Vandana in particular. Thank you so much for asking these wonderful questions. And also thank you, Jyoti Pandey, for asking great questions, and everyone in the chat. So I think there is value in separating between personal and non-personal information. Look, even non-personal information can carry risks, but there are different types of risks. So the Chinese government uses this term critical information, and so which is susceptible to lots of interpretations. Maybe it's information about nuclear engineering, etc. But in general, and the European Union has now proceeded with a new directive on non-personal information, on non-personal data, flowing within Europe, by the way. I mean, it's not outside Europe, which is also interesting. I mean, it's like, like the EU is only willing to go so far, even with non-personal information. You can't take that out. Okay, so question about what the motivations are here. But I'll leave it at, but I think it's useful, and I think it can be helpful.
Tomas, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on what Anupam said. It's I think that the basic conundrum is that if you want to regulate data by law, you need to adopt some kind of categorization, and that categorization can be artificial. So it's what lawyers come up with, what the political process creates, and that might not fit with the kinds of categories that data scientists or data engineers are used to operate with. And it's quite remarkable to what extent this basic distinction between personal data and non-personal data has kind of filtered through the whole digital economy, so that data scientists within companies are trained to avoid personal data to the extent they can, because then they are in the wide open field and outside of data protection law. From a theoretical standpoint, there's a lot of very good work that argues that the distinction is ultimately less important than it might seem, and might be unsustainable for technological reasons that allow for re-identification, or for the potential that even really non-personal data that seems completely unrelated to anyone has some impact on a determination that then matches the identifiability threshold that we usually use for personal data. And I think there's much to be said for this kind of theoretical analysis, but the reality, at least in the EU, is that the distinction is so firmly entrenched, particularly through the GDPR, and you can see that in all the EU data laws that I mentioned, that they reference GDPR 10, 20 times to make sure that the new data law does not touch the GDPR and does not infringe on the protection of personal data, so that at least in the EU, one needs to construct new data law around that distinction between personal and non-personal data, or needs to layer it on top, which should make other countries who don't have data laws yet think harder whether they might be better off with a different kind of categorization or new approaches. And just end on that note, that there's often this desire for global uniformity, because then we'll have global data flows between anyone else. But building on what I said earlier about embracing complexity and differentiation, I think it might also be a time to really experiment, even unilaterally, with new approaches that might then in the long run lead us to better solutions globally.
Neha or Dan, would you like to weigh in?
Well, I fully agree with Thomas. In an ideal world, maybe we could start somewhere else and try to come up with some more nuanced classifications and so on, because it's not always clear what is personal and what is non-personal data and so forth. But I don't think that's one that we can move. There is other areas, like in the context of law enforcement access to data, we talk about traffic data and content data and so on, concepts that are stemming from a different era that ideally should be reconceptualized, I think. But again, it's very difficult to make changes to international agreements that then are based on these terms. I think that's where we get stuck very often.
Yeah, go ahead, Neha.
I think I already pointed this out in my presentation briefly, but the one point that I wanted to emphasize on is, if there's a developing country like India with a new regulator and two new regulators, one for personal data and one for non-personal data, and when it's quite clear that there can be overlaps between the two, and it's not a very straightforward exercise for a regulator to make the distinction, to therefore just be careful and cautious before jumping onto such an ambitious regulatory program. While I do see benefits of enabling flows of non-personal data to the extent it's beneficial for economic innovation. So my point was more about caution that developing country regulators need to exercise while copying GDPR into their domestic regulatory frameworks. So without any judgment whether it's good or bad. And I think that kind of ties into Vandana's second question as well, that this is one of the questions where there are these global standards for data regulation, and then there's a domestic developing country which is trying to promote domestic digital development, trying to make these hard choices. And often then the choice is to stick with domestic digital development because A, it is politically popular, but B, also that it seems somehow easier to manage if everything related to that data and that data-driven sector is within regulatory control.
Thank you. So, and I'll just add also a word, and then I think we need to wrap this panel. There's also the dimension of which global standards, right? Because it's quite possible in the current circumstances for a country, for example, that doesn't like what the GDPR might suggest, to argue that it's inconsistent with standards emanating from the WTO, and for another country that doesn't like that result to argue that it's inconsistent with human rights standards emanating from something in the general bailiwick of the UN. So we have a standards war at the transnational level that it used to be sort of obvious which standards dealt with which domains, but we're running into a problem of convergence now. So my plug would be for regulatory innovation, but of course we'll have to see. So we're supposed to stop because I think there's a break or there's something. And so thank you all to the four wonderful panelists for your thought-provoking interventions, and thank you to the audience for those great questions. Over to you, Anupam.
Yes, thank you so much, Julie, for masterful moderation, and lovely to share the stage with such great speakers. And again, I'm so sorry we're not all together in Hong Kong celebrating, but as Theodore Christakis noted on Twitter, it does make kind of sense to have this conversation in virtual Hong Kong. at this moment, right? It reflects all those kind of, as Dean Traynor said this morning, the conflict between national security, the internet, democracy, all those things, that kind of jumble that is, a conflict across the world simultaneously, I think it's a nice time to be thinking about these things. We will begin again. We'll take a little break so you can wander away from your computer, and we'll begin again in 17 minutes. Okay, see you guys then.